Right. Hi and welcome everyone. My name is Frida and I will be the moderator of tonight's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to go through a couple of Zoom instructions. This seminar will be recorded and you will be able to find it at fuf.se and on our YouTube channel FUF Play afterwards. So if you don't want your picture to be recorded, please turn off your camera. You're more than welcome to leave the video on during this webinar if you want to, but please remember to keep your microphone muted during the entire webinar. And if you have any questions, you can write them in the chat. If you want to, you can choose speaker's view instead of gallery view. By doing this, you will see the person speaking instead of everyone who is present at this webinar. On most devices, this function is found in the right corner of your screen. And this webinar is organized by Swedish Development Forum's event group, which consists of volunteers from the Stockholm region in Sweden. And the Swedish Development Forum is a non-partisan and religiously independent non-profit organization which works to inform, raise awareness, and generate debate about questions relating to sustainable global development. Tonight's webinar will go until 7 p.m. And during the first half, we will listen to tonight's speakers. And the final 45 minutes will be dedicated to questions from the audience. So any questions you might have to the speakers may be asked through the chat. Tonight, we will learn more about using biodiversity preservation as a means to reduce poverty. To tackle this subject, we have invited a panel of 4 speakers from Sweden and Kenya with different perspectives on biodiversity and agroforestry and how they can be a tool to prevent poverty. So first off, we have Olle Forshed from World Wildlife Foundation, followed by Vangu Mutua and Matilda Palm from Agroforestry, Vi-skogen in Swedish. And lastly, we have Jan Beck from Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, Sida. Olle, would you like to start by presenting yourself and tell us a little about your work on biodiversity and agroforestry?
Hi, everyone. Can you see my screen? Or can you see it right now? I have it in hopefully a presenter view. Yes, hi, my name is Olle Forshed and I work here at, actually it's called the Worldwide Fund for Nature, not what you said, Frida. It's an old name. But I'm very happy to be here. I will start with, what is actually biodiversity or biological diversity, which we say today. What is it? We're going to discuss it the whole day, but what is it actually? We have this normal definition, which is then biological diversity means the variability among living organisms from all sources, including inter alia terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are part of. This includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. That's the long, normal definition. But what it means is actually the variation of life on Earth, or if you be even simpler, it's our life on Earth combined. There are many ways of monitoring or describing biodiversity. We have many indexes or tables that tries to show us, because it's quite a difficult thing to actually measure. We have you have probably heard of the red list. We have a red list index, we have species habitat indexes, biodiversity intact indexes, and we have living planet index. I think you have probably heard all of them. Living Planet Index, that's WWF's way of touching on this. And how does it then look like? We can see that more or less all of these indexes, they show that the biodiversity is actually declining among our planet. If you take the Living Planet Index, which actually measure the the average population of vertebrates among our planet, we can see that we have this database contains today around 20,000 populations, and they measure then the size of the population. And we can see that during my lifetime, which is from 1970 until today, we have had a decline in these population sizes of almost, but decline of 68%. And that's it's almost, it's so difficult to just understand, to take that in, I think. But what is then the main drivers for that? Well, there are of course many, and humans are maybe in the center of all these ones. But we can say we have 5 main drivers that actually affect our biodiversity and drive the biodiversity loss among our planet. Number 1, it's habitat loss. With that, that means that all species or organisms, they live somewhere and they live in a habitat. And all those habitats are destroyed in one way. That's mean habitat loss. We have, man has actually affected more or less 75% of our terrestrial land today. Doesn't mean that all terrestrial land is destroyed and not suitable for any kind of species, but it actually has led to a lot of habitat loss for many, many organisms. So that is number 1 key driver for reducing biodiversity on our planet. We also have overexploitation, which means then overfishing, unsustainable hunting. We eat or use the species or the biodiversity. That also has led to a lot of decrease, especially for some species. Then we have other things like invasive species, which means that we move around species to different continents or to different countries or places where they never have been before. And they affect the ecosystems in those places, and also which can lead to that other animals or plants that lived there before can't live there anymore. That's another problem. And then of course pollution, like oil spills or other chemicals that we spread around us. And then we have this climate change, which is the rising star among these 5 drivers. We haven't seen so much decline in biodiversity so far from climate change, but I assume, and many of us assume, that this will be the main driver in the future, since we it will change dramatically the temperatures or water and everything around our world. But maybe it's difficult anyway to really understand what impact we as humans do. I have this is a nice, it's a nice description of how it could be. Unfortunately, it's in Swedish, but it means, what do we have most on our planet? Do we have most wild animals, or do we have most domestic animals? And I want you to think about this. What do you think we have? We can say that, let's say, go 1,000 years back in time, 100% more or less were wild animals. And now when I say animals, I mean mammals here. If you count the biomass of all animals, or all the mammals in the world, how is the percentage? Think about that for 1 second, then I will show you. We have wild or domestic mammals. How much biomass? 60%, 4%, and 36%. So we have 60% domestic animals, like cows, pigs, or whatever. And then we have 36 of another species, which is we're also a mammal. And we only have 4% of all the biomass today that belongs to wild mammals. It's quite a fascinating thing to actually let it sink in. Okay, but does that matter? Does it matter? Do we need biodiversity? Who cares actually? Well, biodiversity, it's actually the most vital part of all the ecosystems we have around us. Without biodiversity, we wouldn't have any, more or less no ecosystems at all. And what those ecosystems do for us as humans is that we use something that we normally call ecosystem services. And what is that then? For example, food production could be seen as that. And we have two main pillars in the food production services. It's the pollination. All the bees that pollinate, or other insects that pollinate all the things we can eat, all vegetables that are pollinated by insects. It's a huge service that this biodiversity provide for us. Another thing which is also similar is soil fertility. Just imagine how many creatures we have in the soil that looks after the soil for us, so we can actually produce. Another very important ecosystem service is, of course, drinking water. We use it every day. Without the biodiversity, the forest, the lakes, or all things we have, you wouldn't have any suitable water for us to drink. Another thing which I think is very important is also the resilience of these ecosystems, that they just exist, and that the biodiversity actually creates the resilience. We can say that the more variety we have within an ecosystem, the more stable it is. So it's actually super important for us to have biodiversity among us. It's actually the foundation for our life, or for all creatures' lives. It's not only we that depend on this, it's everyone. But does it matter then as a way to reduce poverty? Well, of course, it's an important food source. We have a huge variety within crops. I just remember when I worked in Laos some years ago, we counted in that place, we counted the rice varieties, and we came out to 33,000 varieties of rice in that country. Every valley had their own variety. It's also a type of biodiversity, and it also created a very strong and resilient food system because of this huge variety in this area. We have water and protection, of course. It's a way to look at poverty as well, to have access to water and protection. Cash crop, like this guy on the picture here, he collects rattan canes in the forest. It depends on this forest and the biodiversity in this forest to be able to find products that he can sell. And also these resilient systems. It's a very important thing for humans to be to feel that you actually are safe in your daily life. And the stronger ecosystems you have, the more resilient they are, the stronger you and more safe you can feel. You feel. I also think it's very important to keep it's important with biodiversity to keep all the cultures we today see around the world. Just imagine an indigenous group in the Amazon without their forests, and without the biodiversity in the forest. That culture would not exist anymore. So it's actually super important, I think. But I think it's also a little bit dangerous to say that we can use biodiversity as a tool for reducing poverty or things like that. Also, it's not a way to increase the richness in for people. It's bigger than this, and it's bigger than that. It's actually, as I said before, it's the foundation. It's the way to live. We cannot risk these ecosystems and this biodiversity. So I will end with to say that rich biodiversity keeps the poverty away. I think that's important to have in mind. Thank you. I had 30 minutes, sorry.
Thank you so much for that, Olle. That's super interesting to hear your view on this topic. We will now give the digital floor to Wangu Mutua and Matilda Palm from the Agroforestry.
So Wangu there? Wangu, are you there? Wasn't you there?
You seem to have a sound issue, Wangu. I can see you, but I don't hear you.
Okay. But she's not on mute, right? So maybe I should start then, and then Wangu can come in after me. Is that okay?
Yes.
Oh, are you there, Wangu? No. Okay. Let me start. Let's see. Okay, so hello everybody. My name is Matilda Palm and I work for Vi-skogen, or the Agroforestry as we call it in English. I have a background in environmental research, focusing on small-scale agroforestry, biodiversity and climate policy. And right now I'm working with the Agroforestry with our carbon offset program, and also as an advisor in environmental and climate issues. So the Agroforestry's mission is to fight poverty and climate change together. And we do this through agroforestry. And agroforestry is a way of introducing or increasing trees on farmland in a multi-species approach, meaning that we don't work with monocultures with only one species. We have a versatility in our species that we use. We're also strengthening farmer organizations, empower smallholder farmer families to reduce poverty, hunger, deforestation, while at the same time contribute to an increased biodiversity. And I don't really need to go through what biodiversity is because Olle did it so beautifully. So I think we have a really sound base to stand on here. So I'll just skip this one. What Olle ended with, a rich biodiversity fights poverty. That is, of course, very true. But if you look at it the other way around, we also have a vicious circle where ecosystem degradation increases poverty. You can see the two blue arrows here. So the more poverty you have, it pushes the environmental degradation, and it becomes an vicious circle that feeds itself. And the impact of the environmental degradation is most severe for people living in poverty because they have a few livelihoods options to fall back on. would it be possible to reverse this cycle, meaning that a protection of ecosystem will lead to a decrease in poverty? But would that automatically mean a win-win situation? Well, not necessarily, because by traditional means of conserving biodiversity, meaning restricting access or protecting our resources, it risks affecting our global core negatively and risk limiting people's living space and increase vulnerability. So even though you try to do good, it might not result in something good for people's livelihood. And when it comes to biodiversity versus poverty alleviation, there is a need to balance both and to work in what we can call a solution space where ecological integrity is remained, but people are not harmed by the loss of their basic needs. And so why is biodiversity so important? Ole pointed out a few really important stuff. But biodiversity is necessary to sustain our key function of the ecosystem, both its structure and also its processes. And many key ecosystem services provided by biodiversity, such as nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration, pest regulation, pollination, all these things sustain agricultural productivity and thus affect livelihoods in the end. And since the ecosystem services are so closely interlinked, they are also very vulnerable to negative changes, where degradation of one parameter enhances degradation in another. And on top of that, we have the major stresses like climate change and deforestation, both natural and human-induced, that may introduce a negative spiral of poverty and further degradation. So biodiversity provides many key benefits to humans that go beyond the mere provision of raw material, and they are strongly linked to many of the sustainable development goals. And as I showed on the last slide, the provision of ecosystem services is very closely interlinked and has an integrated development approach where you take all these aspects into consideration is crucial for success. As you can see in this picture, they are all connected. You have agricultural biodiversity. So, we're working with agroforestry, so agricultural biodiversity is very important to us. It affects resilient livelihoods, healthy diets and nutrition, sustainable land use, agriculture and forestry, climate change adaptation, and also biodiversity conservation, of course. Oh, shit, sorry, kids are calling. However, when you look at the society, they tend to have various competing goals where many depend on biodiversity. And when humans modify an ecosystem to improve the services it provides, it generally also results in changes to other ecosystem services. So for example, actions to increase food production to one group of users can lead to reduced water availability for other users. So we have an important challenge here, and we need to learn how to strengthen the ecosystem linkages that promote resilience and reverse that vicious cycle of degradation and poverty into a secure win-win situation based on extensive experience and sound research. So I wanted to talk a little bit about agroforestry and biodiversity, since agroforestry is very close to our hearts at Vi-skogen or Vi-skogen. So agroecological approaches such as organic farming, permaculture, regenerative agriculture, and agroforestry, they are seen as sustainable farming system that can support biodiversity while also producing food and fiber to the local communities. However, the success of such a system depends on the setup. So you're not automatically getting a biodiverse rich environment because you use agroforestry. If you just put two species, one permanent, one annual, it needs to be thought out and with a focus. And you can see agroforestry system as a kind of a mean or a median between natural ecosystems and conventional agriculture, as an in-between, where you put agroforestry in between, where you have, it's still a production system where you produce food actively and purposefully for the local communities, but it still has many aspects of the natural ecosystem within it. Or you could also call it like an ecosystem service station, where you can plant patches or a corridor or like a buffer zone around protected areas or around natural ecosystems to protect them further. In addition, agroforestry can function as a mitigation and adaptation of stressors to biodiversity, such as climate change, extreme weather, or variability of weather, which is a huge problem in the global south. So while traditional conservation efforts have focused primarily on attempts to conserve pristine nature in protected areas, such as national parks, with the continued and even accelerating loss of biodiversity, it's clear that this approach alone is not enough to stop the loss of our wild species. And protected areas are an essential part of conservation programs, but they are not sufficient by themselves to protect the full range of biodiversity and can be very difficult to enforce. And more, the importance of the quality of the landscape surrounding these protected areas are being increasingly recognized. And this is where, among others, where We Agroforestry is doing some work. I want to highlight the SEMA project, for example, the Serengeti Mara ecosystem project, where we work with local partners and communities living in the Serengeti Masai Mara National Park and surrounding the park, where you have this wildlife-human conflict and high poverty levels. So we try to strengthen the target communities to adopt sustainable agriculture and livelihoods, and also supporting the ecosystem management and wildlife conservation at the same time through education and other means. We also work a lot with environmental education, as I just mentioned, both for in youth clubs, in schools, but also we have a huge agroforestry education program that our farmers go through and have access to, where we teach agroforestry and sustainable land use methods. We also work with enacting, strengthening, and enforcing environmental legislation, which is very important. So we are discussing with governments about agroforestry legislation and biodiversity issues. We use agricultural practices to reduce pressure on natural environment and to improve agrobiodiversity. We also do some kind of ex situ in situ conservation of biodiversity, where we use highly diverse managed areas, i.e. our agroforestry system, in combination with protection of the surroundings. I think I end there. I had one more slide, but I'll cut that so Vango will have time, because time is just flying. And I hope you got some idea of the issues about poverty reduction in relation to biodiversity that we agroforestry with. So Vango, are your microphone working? Yay! Okay, I'll stop sharing.
Hear me now? Okay, thank you. In a place far from modern technology, and you have to grow the food that you eat. You have to go to the river to get water for your use. Your chickens, your cows, your goats, sheep, they have to rely on what is available in the bushes around you for food. Roots and barks of trees with medicinal value to treat yourself when you get ill. You know that when certain bird flocks appear, it is the season to plant. And that when certain birds are making too much noise at one spot, probably they might have spotted a poisonous snake, and you have to be careful. Around here, ants and mushrooms are a delicacy. And the bees are doing a wonderful job pollinating the fruit trees, which are in full bloom as item in this community. Now, what I have described and so much more is not a utopia situation. It is actually a reality for many people living in some of the rural areas in the region where we are working. And for sure, humans rely on nature in so many ways than we can imagine. Modernity, as we can call it, rely on a healthy balance in nature. Biodiversity can therefore not be far removed from everyday life. A healthy ecosystem will ensure a balanced biodiversity, and this can only happen if we all use sustainable ways and methods in going about our everyday life. Agroforestry is how we contribute to this. When you remove what nature provides for free, you not only affect the living organisms that rely on this for survival, but you also disturb the very support system that humans also rely on. So in our ecosystem that supports life, cannot be separated.
Thank you so much for that, Wangu and Matilda. That's really interesting. And I'm glad that the technology worked lastly. So now we will move on to Jan van Beck from Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, Sida, to share his views and experiences on this topic.
Okay, thank you very much, Frida, for that. And thank you both Ole, Matilda, and especially Wangu for giving such a nice description of the need of biodiversity for people. So my name is Jan van Beck, and I work as a senior policy specialist on environment and climate at the Sida's policy support unit, mainly focusing at the moment on biodiversity. So what I'm going to present and share with you is a little bit of the work that Sida are doing right now on mainly the new assignment that we have gotten from the government on biodiversity and ecosystems. But I thought I wanted to start with saying that working with the biodiversity at Sida is not something new. I mean, Sida was pretty early on in the strategic work regarding biodiversity and development cooperation. I mean, the first guidelines we have were published already in 1991, and then we have continued this work. And as early as in the 1990s, environmental impact assessment was mandatory for all our contribution and all our partners to do. That has changed a little bit, but we still have environmental assessments that are mandatory to be carried out in all our contributions that we do. If this is done, that's another question, and we can come back to that. Then I wanted to share also this slide of Sida is each year reporting under the framework of the Convention of Biodiversity. So we're contributing to Sweden's reporting on biodiversity. And this table can be found in a one-pager that is available at our webpage. If you just look for Sida biodiversity related support, you will find it. So it shows, I mean, it's a lot of numbers to take in here, but I think we can go to the total column, the one to the far right-hand side, and maybe focus on 2018, 2019, because we started weighing parts of the contribution from 2018. So the previous early numbers are not really good comparable, but I mean, you can all see that there we are increasing our support marked with a Rio marker for biodiversity. Although yeah, it's still kind of a low level. I think the principal objective is 4% of the total or something like that. And we're not, yeah, we've set up internal targets also and we're not really reaching those. Okay, so I thought I'd touch a little bit on why biodiversity is coming up now so strongly. And I think, I mean, it really started with the work leading up to the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services and the report, the Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services that was released in 2019, which really got the attention of the global community. All of a sudden, everyone started to realizing what was going on and that the consequences could be quite severe. And I think maybe one of the big recognitions is when the economists start talking about it, and that's the picture or the graph that you have to the right there, which is from the World Economic Forum report on long-term risks. And you see that biodiversity loss is one of the green dots over there. And then we also had in the 2020, I mean, was supposed to be a super year for nature with both the Convention on Biodiversity leading up to the Convention of the Parties in Kunming in China and the adoption of a new global biodiversity framework post 2020. And then the climate COP also in Glasgow. Well, of course, we all know that something came in between, and we are now not sure. I mean, everyone is working for a biodiversity COP in autumn, but yeah, we'll see if it will come up or not. So all of these things made this like a political priority. Countries started realizing that things are needed to be done, and this also transpired down to us at Sida, and in our 2019 assignment, we got an assignment in our letter of appropriation that we should suggest measures to strengthen and deepen the agency's work with biodiversity. And after that, the mills move slowly. And I mean, it was first, we delivered that report in September 2020, and we got an assignment in end of October last year, where we got a special assignment on biodiversity and ecosystem. So I thought I should talk a little bit of that as well. This assignment then covers from 2020 to 2023, and the way it has been described by at least the former minister was that this is a new way of doing development cooperation, where it's important to also consider the effects of biodiversity of all the activities that we are doing. It doesn't come with any or like a big pile of money. We have gotten 100 million to the regional Africa strategy, and that's the funding that has come with this assignment. But it's very clear, on the other hand, on what the government expects us to do. I mean, and the line I've copied in there: Sida shall strengthen and deepen the work on biodiversity and ecosystems in all operations. So this is not doing a little bit here, a little bit there. This is talking about the whole of Sida. And also in the assignment, there are a couple of bullet points that we have condensed into 5 main areas, and then I'm excluding the one I just talked about to the regional Africa strategy. So the first one is integration. And this is maybe one of the most important, I would say, points that we can work with as Sida. We have a lot of activities going on. I mean, Ole was describing the drivers, and somewhere I think we need to be better at knowing what effects our contribution will have when it comes to driving with the drivers of biodiversity loss. So that's one big area where I think we can make a lot of improvements. And just a small example is looking at the health sector, for instance, and comparing Sida's portfolio of health has nothing that is marked with biodiversity. But if you look at the OECD DAC, you have plenty. So just there, started the conversation with the people working on health will most likely do a lot. Then the second pointer is strengthening the existing activities and or contributions that we have, both when it comes to policy dialogue and these kind of things. So making the actors that are currently working in this area even stronger, being a stronger voice for this. The third one is mobilize funding, additional funding, and especially here, I don't know how much where you are, but the guarantee instrument is mentioned here as one way of doing that. Then we have the normative dialogue, which is then the dialogue around biodiversity to have that with the UN system actors, but also the EU Commission is mentioned here specifically. And then the last one is the connection with other perspectives and thematic areas. So for those of you who know a little bit of Swedish Development Cooperation, we have 5 perspectives that is cross-cutting through everything. And for instance, democracy and gender is both mentioned specifically here. But the way we see it is that this is also going both ways, because democracy, for instance, is of course a prerequisite for biodiversity. I mean, if you have a large company coming in striking a deal with the president and the people doesn't have the right to get their voices heard, we will lose biodiversity. So, but if we have the democratic principles in place, it might be easier for them to make their voices heard, and we might save biodiversity. So we need to learn from each other here. Okay, so just some short words how we are planning as Sida to take this assignment forward. I mean, as I said, it encompasses the whole of our work. So we have formed an internal agency committee to look at these 5 areas and try to get some actions and activities done to really being able to deliver a change here. We have an environmental management system, which is then a way to measure this, but most likely it is going to be through the amount of funding and the real marker. I can also say that we have separate reporting times for this assignment to the government. So, and all the signals that we get in our connection to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is that this is highly prioritized. It was even mentioned in the Foreign Declaration, the work of biodiversity. So this is not something that we as an agency will manage to do with our left hand. We will need to go all in on this. And then we also will coordinate with the other assignments. We have a democracy assignment as well. And as I said, this is a dual learning. So, and of course, we're in the early days of taking this assignment and making making something out of it. But we also have these thoughts about how could we use the Swedish resource space to help us or contribute, and also with the learning from each other with this assignment. So that was what I was going to share with you today.
Thank you so much, Jan. That's really interesting, and it's a complex issue to tackle. So now we're going to open up the floor for some questions from the audience. So once again, if you have any questions to the speakers or would like them to discuss anything that's been brought up or hasn't been brought up, you can write these in the chat. But we've got some questions already, actually, so I'm gonna start with the first one. What are the challenges with using agroforestry as a method relating to biodiversity? For example, conflicts over who owns the land, conflicts between small scale and large scale farming. So whoever is interested in answering that can go ahead.
Well, maybe I can start. We are not working with the large-scale agroforestry. We were working with small-scale farmers and often introducing them to agroforestry. And of course, that doesn't mean that there are no trees on their land, but introducing someone to agroforestry can be learning about agroforestry and learning about methods that you can enhance your productivity by having a more diverse spread of species, for example, including permanent species together with annual species on your land will give you a resilient if the weather is not going to be what you expect it to be, for example. And we, I mean, I can't talk in general about the difficulties about land tenure and agroforestry because that might vary so much from different areas. But in our countries, we work with farmer who owns their land. It's on their land. So there's no tenure issue with us. But when I have worked with previous communities in Myanmar about shifting cultivation, for example, where they use agroforestry, of course, there are major issues with land tenure since the government is basically owning the land. And this is the case in many areas where the government might be owning the land or the farmers might have the user rights. And then, of course, one of the major problems with agroforestry and in the legislation is that agroforestry often falls in between two chairs. It's not straight agriculture and it's not straight forestry. So it falls very often between two ministries. So you have usually the Ministry of Forestry and the Ministry of Agriculture, and nobody is interested in tackling issues related to agroforestry. So that can definitely be a challenge. I'm not sure if I answered the question here, but maybe Wango wants to fill in more regarding that.
I think you've answered it pretty much. I don't put on my video because I realize my internet is a bit shaky. What I wanted to add on is that even where maybe the families might not have the title over the land where they are living in and working on, it's very common in this region that families have over the years been working on a certain land, and it's recognized by government that this land is within within a specific family. So kind of they have a tenure even if they haven't like processed the paperwork to get the
I think your internet is lacking a bit at the moment, Wangu.
The title deed as a paper. So there is that issue of moderator, please take up.
Yeah, sorry. I think it's yeah, it's a bit unstable, the internet. We got a bit of what you said, but not the entire thing. So I might just go on to the next question, and hopefully we can.
But can I say something
Yes.
to reply on that question? I think we should be a little bit careful just to use agroforestry as the solution here, because agroforestry can actually mean a lot of things, especially if you look at the small scale agroforestry that Vi-skogen practices, and if you compare it with the large scale agroforestry. It doesn't come by default that agroforestry is benefiting biodiversity. It's not like that. So it can absolutely do that, but we must look at what it actually, what's the agroforest in this place? What are we actually doing? So it can be very helpful, but sometimes we can also use agroforestry as just a word. Yeah.
Have you seen examples of that yourself when it's not used the right way or in a good way?
Yeah, but it can be used in the right way, but anyway, it doesn't need to be good for biodiversity. It can be, you can have agroforestry systems with 2 species more or less. But the very advantage with agroforestry is that it normally most often contain trees, and trees actually, it's a habitat for many other species most often, if you don't use exotic trees, say, in an environment where they shouldn't be and so on. So, but it's important to just think what we actually do in that and that places, so we don't mix everything up and just use this as an excuse. Or as I think that's very important.
But I like to use, and I heard you use that word also, Matilda, agroecology, because agroecology really encompasses a little bit more, and as I mean, it's agroecology is not a method. I mean, it's a range of methods, but where you try to look at the preconditions at the specific site and trying to find a system that is more adapted to the local place where you are.
Are we raising hands when we want to say something, or how are we doing this?
You can go ahead if you want to.
No, I think that's a really good point, both Olle and Jan. And I think I've tried to highlight that it's you know, the setting is what is important for the success when it comes to biodiversity. And then, of course, as Olle said, if you introduce trees in an annual agricultural setting, you will get different benefits that might not benefit biodiversity per se, but maybe erosion or soil quality, for example. But I wanted to highlight what Jan said about biodiversity or agroecology. Sorry. But you have to start looking from a baseline. So if you're going to change something now, and if you're going to change an agriculture where you have monoculture or annual crops and just one species, and you want to change that, I mean, you won't have a very wide biodiversity if you add trees, but there will still be like a step towards something. So it will be like you are thinking about what you're doing, and that can in turn lead to other things. So I think we should see what we have and what we can change it into. Yeah, that's.
Thanks for that. So we've got a question from the audience. How important is indigenous knowledge and practices for biodiversity and poverty alleviation? And how do you combine this with the science and research? So who feels like that? I would like, is Wangu's internet any better? Or does Olle maybe want to answer that one?
I'm not sure if you hear me well. I don't know what have happened this evening.
We can hear you.
Looks like it's working.
But do you... Okay, great. I think indigenous knowledge, you definitely have to listen to the communities and to the people. They know better what works fine, which type of species, if you're considering to do tree planting, what is growing, what was originally growing and maybe was cleared off and definitely has better chances of survival. So you have to factor in indigenous knowledge. And also there are things that are related to people, maybe because they have other cultural value, and so the communities would take care of such even more and better because they are connected in this way. So absolutely important.
I can add, and I completely agree with Mango. It's super important to listen to local knowledge and to indigenous knowledge, and for the reason that we have so much knowledge, and the knowledge is quite adapted to that particular place. So most often when we try to learn people, we have it from one place, and we want to learn everyone the same thing, but actually we maybe need different knowledges for every place, for every valley. They have been, it's different, and sometimes we forget that. So that's why I think it's very important. And I also see now it's actually more or less a trend that we are monitoring local knowledge, especially for forest dwelling people and how their cultural systems. So I think it's actually been very highlighted for the moment to listen to what the indigenous people have to say.
I totally agree with that one. So we got a question from Bridget. Do communities in your project areas already have agroforestry systems, or has the project introduced agroforestry? What do you consider when deciding what tree species to include in the agroforestry systems? Historically, agroforestry projects have not been very successful in sub-Saharan Africa. What new approaches are you using to get past previous failures? Timothy.
I think Vangu might actually be best to answer this one.
Yeah, I can give our experience in this region. What we do, we don't just look at the tree, but
I think it's a bit shaky again.
The species we look at, we have. Oh, is it better now?
No, it seems to be.
Do you hear me?
Want to try again? Yes.
Yes. Okay, let me repeat. I wanted to say that the way we work with agroforestry in the region is in a way that it provides whether it's boundary planting for the farmer to be able to mark their lands, which is quite a thing in this region. Whether it's fixing trees, whether it's those who might have some bit of space and want to have woodlot. So it's a mix of several services that you're trying to get from the trees, timber and fruits and all these things. And it's a whole list of species that we promote that must be, they must not be competing with maybe food crops, for example. So they must be those species that can actually be intercropped or be mixed so to say, planted within the same space that the farmer has. Remember, we are working with largely farmers who don't have very huge, vast land. So whatever it is that they're doing has to be providing more of support to the farmer within the small space that they have. And for the farmers, it's very common that they embrace agroforestry. The thing is with the choice of the type of trees that will work for them. That's where the education becomes very important. So they are able to plant the right trees in the right places to provide. I hope you heard me.
Yeah, we heard most of it, I think. That's really interesting how you work with the local farmers to ensure it's the right crops and that it works for them. So we got a question from Jan. If you have limited funds to work with biodiversity and are going to work through different strategies or funding modalities, will you then have a major influence on their assessment and also competence development of staff? Do you understand that question?
Yeah, I think I do. And I mean, this is one of the things that I have tried to highlight in the learning events we've had at Sida around biodiversity, that the way for our own staff, but also for the partners that we have to increase the knowledge is to, we work very much with the markers. The markers are really important. And I mean, if you set integration with this marker, that you have to have a goal on biodiversity, that's the only way, as I see it, to increase the knowledge both within Sida but also within the partners, and then you can also start having a dialogue. But only hearing about it like this, I mean, you have to envision that you're a program officer and you have this organization that you are working with, and the organization is not so knowledgeable about biodiversity. And the only way to increase that knowledge, I don't believe only to have learning events and giving information materials. I mean, you have to start asking questions, start to see in this project what can we do to be a little bit more concrete. So and that will then, as I see it, give that kind of result to increase knowledge both on this side and on the partner side.
Thank you for that. So we got a question that anyone who wants can start to answer. Relating to agroforestry, there are also challenges between men and women, where a man culturally owns land and a woman, who is his wife, tills the land. Men have also preferred eucalyptus that do not favor much biodiversity, while women prefer multi-purpose trees, for example, moringa and caliandra. Any reflections on the need to include other factors such as gender?
If this is the case, of course, it's super important to focus on the women, since they tend to take more trees that are more favorable for biodiversity. I think in general, when it comes to what kind of species we have, it's a little bit sad sometimes that we also within many of these agroforestry systems, we use like global tree species or global crops. It would be very interesting to focus more on the local species that we have. And maybe it's what we can see that in this case that women maybe take the daily life or the normal trees around them, and they see the advantages in that in a better way, because men tends to be more favorable of the new cool things, which then the eucalyptus tree could be seen as. So I think it's of course super important to actually consider all people in the groups. They have to maybe develop their own systems, but it would be very interesting to focus more on the research on local and indigenous species in the systems. I think that would be, but when it comes to preserve the biodiversity, it would be very advantage to do that, I think.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to answer that question? Or
yeah, I can come in, but I'm not sure if it's connected to biodiversity, maybe more to the gender aspects of this. But I was part of a project in Tanzania where we did a community vulnerability and capacity assessment, and it was kind of fascinating to see the different strategies. I mean, here it comes to the kind of the way of thinking between how it might be between men and women, but there the men often they went into town to try to get some cash labor, while the women were left behind and trying to find different ways of you know, from the lands, doing different kind of things. The men came back and I mean at times not with any money, but maybe with an extra wife and a kid to feed. So I mean the gender aspects here also is really important, and looking at Sida's biodiversity support, we also report on the gender integration on this support, and that is around 90%. So of the biodiversity support that we have, we also integrate gender up to 90%. And then I want to just take the opportunity to do some commercial, because on the 4th of May, we're going to have a development talk about gender, climate, and biodiversity, which I think anyone interested in this topic could have a good time listening into.
That sounds really interesting. Rangu or Matilda, would you like to share any thoughts on this subject, or should I move on with the questions?
I can say something because in the region here, definitely must put into consideration due to a very strong the choice of species. You see it playing out more or less, because men, like someone has the person who wrote here, would prefer, you know, the trees that they can easily sell, make quick money, and for us, trees like eucalyptus, we are not promoting that, because then you cannot grow crops underneath. It's like even grass will not grow in most cases in some of the woodlots that I have seen for eucalyptus. But women, we will more often be attracted to a mix of trees that they can get things that will support them, whether it's for getting firewood or for getting trees like leaves, neem. The leaves of neem tree is boiled, for example, for its medicinal value and things like this. So they will more often want to go for use within the home, while more often than not, the men are more likely to be drawn to maybe wood lots that will grow very, quickly and make quick. Related to that also is the question that was earlier regarding the ownership of land. And before I got my connection became a bit shaky. What I wanted to add there is about the question of how much invested a woman would be to land that is not assured to her that she can be working within, still be able to derive the benefits that come from it. So definitely the question of gender and land and access becomes a critical one as well in the setup that we are working in.
Yeah. Thank you, Wangu. Okay, now we're gonna move on to a question from Louis. It says, firstly, thank you so much for organizing this interesting webinar. I appreciate the questions about Indigenous knowledge and would like the panelists to elaborate further based on their experience on collective territorial rights and the importance of compensating Indigenous and tribal communities for the environmental services they provide. I'm gonna direct that one to Ole maybe, or Matilda. Do you have any inputs on this one?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe I have. No, I think examples, of course, there are many examples. Maybe not only linked to agroforestry, but to traditional cultivating systems inside forests, for example, could be a very stable food source. So that's I have some examples from Kalimantan or Borneo in Indonesian Borneo, where the forest then become the major for these forest people. They see the forest as the mother of their cultivating systems, because they understand that if we have a healthy forest, we can still cultivate our rice inside the forest. And I went to a very, I have a both happy and horrible memory from a trip also to Borneo, when we went out to the forest. We thought it was to the forest, but it was actually converted to an oil palm plantation, a huge one. That community, they rented out their land 10 years ago to this big palm oil company. And the thing that struck me in this when we get to this village was that it was so, people were so poor and they were really, a lot of alcohol. It was just a disaster. It was horrible. And we were there one day, and some people were working in these monocultural oil plant plantation landscapes. But then after this visit, we went to the neighboring village, and they had the different experience, because they never rented out their forest. And they had their forests still intact. And they had it and they cultivated and collected things in that forest. And the feeling you had when you came to that forest or to that village was so strikingly different. People were happy. We had meals in their longhouses, and it actually, you could understand how important that the biodiversity of the forests are for those people. So to really look at, to make, of course, they had the same life before those two villages, but maybe they came. Yeah, they had different. They made different decisions once in a time, and you can see what it actually means to be able to look in the future. You don't know, huh? But that is one memory that is always following me. I think it was very interesting, or very. It's a good picture how to understand the value of forest and the biodiversity. Yeah, I don't know if it was an answer on this question, but you asked for examples. So that could be an example of how very important it is to listen to many way the traditional way of life in these rural areas.
Thanks for that, Olga.
I can maybe try to answer a part of that question. I'm not that knowledgeable about collective territorial rights or land rights per se, but I have been working quite a bit on payment for ecosystem services, or putting a financial value on ecosystem services. And the question is very tricky because well, first of all, you need, if you want to sell the provision of ecosystem services, you need somebody to buy. And by getting somebody to buy means that the whole society needs to value that service. And that is not always the case. But we can see many examples of payment for environmental services in many countries where it functions quite well. New York State, for example, has a functioning service where they protect forest or plant trees to help purify the water for New York City, so they don't have to invest as much in water purification. So that is a system that works quite well. And I know Costa Rica has also payment for environmental services that work well. But there's also a risk when you put a value on somebody's provision of a service, you also make that service or the provision of that service attractive for others. So if you make it a source of income, for example, say carbon, if you make protection of forest valuable in a carbon sense, then you may risk getting other interest in that part of land, for example. So if you don't, like Wango said, for example, you have been cultivating a land for centuries, and you have the traditional right to that land, but when you put something on it that will generate income, the government might want that land back. So it's very tricky, because in a sense, of course, the provision of services should be valued. But if it's right to put a financial value on it, I'm not sure. And we can see both successful and failures in the payment for ecosystem services. Yeah, I don't know if that answered the question, but at least it was touching upon the issue of putting a financial value on services, which can be very tricky and hard. And I don't have a straight answer, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a very complex situation, I guess.
But in a way, it all boils down to the economic system that we have, where everything that is nature is seen as an externality. And I mean, so that is yeah. And then trying to integrate this externality into an ongoing theory, because the national economic system is really just a theory, it becomes kind of tricky. I rather like these pictures, for instance, with the SDGs, where you have the SDGs 6, 13, 14, and 15 as a basis, and you have to fit your societies and your economy within that space, because it kind of, you know, the nature sets the boundaries, and yeah, we have to fit the other things within that space.
Are you speaking for putting a financial value on ecosystem services? I didn't quite get you.
No, I'm speaking of the difficulty of putting a financial value on something that is not, you know, which that is seen as an externality within the existing system. So
right, okay.
Really, just what you said. I think your examples were good, really.
Yeah,
good.
no, because, you know, if the national economist would, you know, try to get a value on every, we wouldn't be able to afford nature. I mean, given the value it actually provides. So it's very hard to pick and choose on what you should put a value on and who should get that. And I would guess that tribal communities wouldn't be the first to receive any money for that value. So, yeah. But it's good that we discuss it, I think, and learn from each other.
All right, we got another question here. So this is also to everyone in the panel. It's hard to see the impact if it's not measured. What biodiversity assessment methodology is, in your opinion, the most useful for quantifying changes in biodiversity in context of interactions with agricultural production systems?
I can start if you want. I don't have an answer to the question, and this is a question I ask myself. So with all the possibilities of measuring biodiversity, which one should you choose for what results? I mean, you need to look at the end result. What do you want to find out about the system if you to decide on what you want to measure? I mean, and you have so many parameters within biodiversity. You have composition, distribution, variability, abundance, location, time. There's just so much. And I have been trying to coach PhD students in how to measure biodiversity. And we kind of land on agrobiodiversity, where we count species of use to the community, because it's super, super hard. So maybe Ulla and Jan has an answer to this, because I would really like to know.
I don't know if I have an answer, but I mean, if we draw on the kind of the experience, the way we do it in Sweden to a large extent is to measure trends. You know, trends of bird species, trends of forest composition, and by doing, you know, measuring trends, we can also connect certain changes in the landscape to increase or loss of biodiversity. Then of course it can be more complex than that, but I think using trends is one way of doing it, and then looking at specific ecosystems, or I mean, looking at forests, for instance. If you have a intact forest cover, then I mean, but then of course you can go in there and you find no hardwood species because they have all been taken out. But so it's tricky. Ole, I hand this over to you.
Yeah, oh, thanks. No, of course it's tricky, but trends, I think it's a good way to measure on the big scale. But I think the one thing is also to measure like on the small scale, and what can you do as the farmer? How can you measure on your plot or your valley? And we can always see that in a natural forest, it will always contain so much more biodiversity than any agriculture system will ever do. So that there's no use to maybe compare them in that sense. But I think it's also very important for the small scale farmer to know what to do, how to actually increase the biodiversity. How do you do it? And of course, the most simple is to just count the species you have. It's maybe the first step you will take. It's better with 2 species than 1 if you look at the biodiversity, and to work from that one. But I got some companies here behind me. But so that could be one thing to think about, which level we are talking about. If it's on a global scale, yeah, then we try to measure them. That's the way I showed you before. But I think it's also very important for the local person to find ways to understand how to increase the biodiversity in his plots or her plot or whatever it will be.
Yeah, and can I also feed in that when we talk about local ecological knowledge, I mean, including the indigenous people in the research or in the policymaking, they know better than any of us how the biodiversity has changed in their surroundings. If you talk to people, they will be able to say that we don't have this many bird species, or we don't have this many monkey species, or it's usually very clear to them how the surrounding has changed. So listening in would be a very good way to start. And I totally agree, Jan. Trends are a great way of looking at it. The problem is when you start something new. For example, if you're gonna evaluate the biodiversity measures you are doing at Sida, and you don't have set trends since, I mean, you need a time scale to set a trend. And if you're only working, like for example, my PhD student, they have 4 years. It's not enough to make trends. And if you don't have the data from before, it can be super tricky. So, but yeah. Okay.
Right. We're gonna have to wrap this up. This is so interesting, and we haven't even had time to answer all the questions from the audience. But I'd like to end with a short answer from everyone in the panel about what you think the future of biodiversity conservation as a strategy to reduce poverty holds.
I think you need to decide, direct the
I'm first, okay. Well, I think I would like to end as I ended my presentation. I think we should not really see that biodiversity is a tool for reducing poverty. I think it's more, it's actually bigger than that. It's the foundation. We need to preserve the foundation so we can keep the poverty away. I think that's something that I would like to share from my side.
Thanks, Ole. And Jan, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, the challenges, of course, are huge. But I mean, looking at it from a Sida point of view, I totally agree what Ole said, and I think that the kind of political momentum that we have now is to set this new direction for development cooperation, and in that sense, it can only be better.
Yeah, hopefully. Wangu, do you want to share with us what you think the future holds for biodiversity?
Sorry, I was mute. For me, my thoughts on this is that we have to look into how we carry on our everyday life of ourselves and every other living organism is supported. So we have to ensure that whatever it is that we do, we must showing that. So that has to be a business for all of us, regardless of whatever it is that we do on our everyday lives.
Thank you. And Matilda, do you have a last word before we finish this one off?
I just want to say that I'm very hopeful because I see increased awareness in so many areas, in research and in development cooperation and in policy development. So I just feel like I hope biodiversity won't be a buzzword, but I can feel a genuine sense of care from people. So I'm really happy that we are moving on from only thinking about climate to a more holistic way of looking at ecosystems and the provision of services they provide. So I'm very hopeful.
Thanks for that last word. All right, that's it for tonight. I'd like to finish off with a massive thank you to our panel, Olle, Wangu, Matilda, and Jan. Thanks for sharing your knowledge and experiences with us tonight. It's truly been an eye-opener. And thank you to everyone who has attended this webinar and asked questions. We hope that you have learned something or simply just enjoyed the discussions. If you like to share the webinar with your friends or rewatch it yourself, you can find it on FUF's YouTube channel in a few days. And finally, if you like the work that we do at Swedish Development Forum, you can become a FUF member yourself. It's 150 krona, Swedish krona for students and 200 Swedish kronas for everyone else. So you can find more information on our website, fuf.se. Thank you so much, everyone.